All right. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. Am I Jason Abair? We're doing that French thing. Anyway, our guest today is the amazing Dr. Emily Herring. She is a writer based out of Paris, and she just produced this amazing book that I have right here that you can't see if you're listening, but I promise you I'm holding it. It's called Herald of a Restless World, How Henri Bergson Brought Philosophy to the People. And Emily, I am so excited to talk to you about this book today and your work. So thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
This is going to be fun today. This is the very first biography I've ever read on a philosopher. And so this was a delight actually to be able to sit down and like get inside the head of this guy and so forth. And we'll jump into him in a second. But there was a thing that I really dug about what you were writing about, which is like you're writing about the man, you're writing about his thoughts, but also the world around him. There's all this different cool stuff going on with the story. And it was a delight to like kind of spend time with you writing about him as I read this book. So thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that.
Absolutely. So, okay. So before we start talking about our philosopher in question, am I pronouncing that correct?
Yeah. So
closely enough?
Very much closely enough.
Okay.
It's actually it's a Polish name anyway, so that
Okay.
Sometimes Anglophones are tempted to say Bergson, but actually that's not that would be, I guess, the French pronunciation, but that's not how it's pronounced because it's Bergson. It's a Polish name, so it's closer to what you were saying.
I just love that. Thank you. I always feel like names are so personal. What a person wants to be called or anything like that. So I do my darndest to make sure that I'm. And thank you, to say things correctly, but you never know. All right, but let's talk about you for a second. Can you want to introduce yourself and who you are?
Sure. So I'm Emily Herring, as you've already said.
Yes, correctly.
I grew up between the UK and France. I'm a dual citizenship. I have both nationalities, which is nice. And I studied most of my life. I was in France, and in France, in high school, everyone studies philosophy. So that's where I first encountered Bergson. And then I ended up sort of going on all the way to doing a PhD in both philosophy and the history of science.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very interested in the history of biology. And Bergson came up again. I mean, my dissertation was on his book on evolution and how it was received by biologists. So I managed to get Bergson into there as well. And then after that, I attempted a career in academia and quickly realized. So I got a postdoc and I sort of, I was doing everything right. And then sort of the pandemic hit and I realized my priorities were very different to what they had once been. And I sort of dropped out I quit my postdoc. And actually, so now I'm back living in Paris where I grew up, and I'm working as a writer and an editor, freelance, which has been great.
This sounds actually just delightful.
It is.
You and I have very similar stories. I finished my PhD in 2022. I went back to school later in life, finished my PhD in 2022. And, went on the market, looked at academia, and very quickly realized this was not the space, the intellectual space, or really even, I don't know, even the physical spaces that I wanted to inhabit anymore. It's like I had created this idea in my mind of what professorial life would be and the kind of life, I think sometimes, at least for me, I thought, it's going to be so exciting to be Dr. Herbert, and I'll have my office and I'll have my students and it'll be great. And none of them will cheat and all of them will do the readings. And, here in the States, you have so little control over your own life when you go into that academic career. You don't know where you're going to live.
Yeah,
you don't really know the pay is awful. And I was fortunate enough to where, my own doctorate was in indigenous and environmental history. And I went into working with the Forest Service out here, working with tribes. And I was like, this is so much more rewarding. I get to spend all of my time. I'm heading out to Oklahoma for a week next week just to go visit with people and go to museums and eat lots of great food. And I'm like, why would I ever have thought that I wanted to be a professor to begin with? But it was a very challenging decision.
Yeah.
And scary, I think, Emily. I don't know if you had this thing too when I was like, am I really, I don't want to say walk away because you just wrote a book. I'm holding it in my hand. We're doing the things, just not in the ways that like maybe we had conceptualized.
I remember listing all the things I actually liked about academia and all the things I disliked. And I realized I could still do all the things I liked, without being in academia, sort of the research and the writing.
Yeah.
It's still possible. I think it was also, as you said, a matter of that sort of early career stuff where you don't know where you're going to end up. I ended up in Belgium for my postdoc just as the pandemic sort of was starting. So it was the worst possible time to be moving countries. But it was just very much a matter of, oh, actually, no, I want to be living in a place that I choose. I want to own my own furniture. I want a dog.
Right.
Which just wasn't possible if I was going contract to contract, moving around all the time into my 30s,
Yeah, I think
so. It's a question of priorities.
Right. I felt like, actually, I never want to say that I left academia because I'm still very much involved in these dialogues, but it's of my own choosing.
Yeah.
I feel, before we get into the book. Did you get the dog?
I did get the dog. Yes, she's amazing.
Tell me about the dog.
She's called Maddie, and she is a Labradoodle, which is not common at all in France. I know they're all over the place
everywhere
in North America, but actually there are very few of them here, so people are really confused when they see her because they don't know what she is.
Really?
And no, she's the best, and it's changed my life for the better in every possible way.
What you can't, I don't know if you can, is he, oh, he's sleeping back behind me. There's a big black puppy right back who's 90 pounds now. He's a Labrador mix. And I thought when I was getting him, I was getting a lab. And then he just kept eating and kept getting bigger and bigger. And it turns out he's actually a Lab Great Dane mix.
Wow.
Yeah. So that affected the amount of money I spend on food every single month, and also the things that I could do with him. He's lovely, but he's sleeping in the floor, which is exactly where I want him to be right now. All right, so we've talked about labs, we've talked about us. Let's talk about Henri Bergson. You said you became familiar with him. You write about this in the book. At one point in time, he was the most famous man in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I had never heard of the man before I saw your book. And I was like, this is fascinating. You came to see him, you came to know him first in high school, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah, in philosophy classes.
Wow, okay.
Which is we're very lucky to have that in France, I think. I mean, I'm not sure everyone would agree, but I loved it. I loved doing philosophy at such a young age and sort of starting to learn about all the classics. And yeah, I encountered Bergson briefly, ideas about language at the time, and then my curiosity was piqued, and then I sort of kept exploring.
Yeah, it seems like you just kept coming back to him because, you went to your doctorate and you were history of science, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much science in this. And of course, as I read through the book, I start to see, wait a sec, this philosopher is really kind of engaging with science and vice versa. The scientists, and we'll name drop now, because if you're reading this book, you're going to see names like Darwin and you're going to see Einstein. And this was not what I was expecting going in, which is the thing that I absolutely loved. You noted, however, very early on in the book, you had some real difficulties to write this is the first biography of this man in English, correct?
Right, yeah.
Thank you for that. I could not have read this in French. It would have been a challenge. Talk to me a little bit about what that was like, because the majority of his notes of his unpublished work was burned by his widow, correct?
Yes, at his request. So it wasn't an act of vengeance or whatever.
That would have been even juicier.
He requested this, I assume, because of his immense fame that you just noted, that he was so famous and he was so used to his privacy being invaded that I think he was probably very worried about the ways in which his privacy would continue to be invaded after his death, and probably in ways that he wouldn't be able to control. But so, yeah, it is kind of a nightmare if you're a biographer. But luckily, so the sad thing is that he was apparently working on something in the sort of decade before he died, which doesn't exist. But luckily, a lot of his correspondence and a lot of stuff about him survived because of his notoriety, because anyone who had anything that he had touched that had his name on it, they kept. So there's just so much... there is so much still, luckily, in terms of archives, despite his decision.
Yeah, it seems like there were plenty of people who were happy to write about him, whether or not they liked him or not. I'm thinking about Bertrand Russell. Am I saying that? Yeah. Boy, I'm going to try. I'm just going to anglicize everything.
And Russell is English. Russell's a British philosopher, so Bertrand Russell, you can just say it.
I feel like, Emily,
you can say everything French with a French accent. That will make it fun.
here in the United States, we have the people who will say croissant. I'm like, stop already. Just stop. All right. You live in New Hampshire. All right. Well, let's talk about Henri himself a little bit, because you introduce us to this really cool story. We're opening up into this big lecture hall, and it's not Henri at all who is giving these lectures. This guy is a superstar. When we first meet him, and people are lining up hours in advance, sitting down to sitting through other lectures just to get to his lecture so they don't miss a seat. Before we get to that, can we do a little backstory about who this man was, where he comes from? Talk about his Polish ancestry. He's Jewish. He's a Jewish man with some really interesting complications to that, especially towards the end of his life. Can we talk a little bit about who he was as a younger guy and how he comes into philosophy?
Sure. So he was born into a family of, so his father was a Polish Jewish musician who studied with Chopin, studied piano, and was a composer, but sort of a failed composer, I guess, or not a very successful one. A struggling composer is probably a nicer way of saying it. And so it was a family that struggled quite a bit financially, especially because they did end up having quite a few children, and they moved around a lot. But when he was around 10 years old, so the family was in Paris, and he was born in Paris as well. And there he just was such a sort of academic, brilliant child that he managed to get all these scholarships in these quite prestigious sort of secondary schools. But his family then moved to London, Bergson's mother was also Jewish, but British, born in Britain. So all of his family moved to Britain, and leaving him alone in the city of Paris during quite a tumultuous time, because there was a war against Prussia, and then there was the events of the Commune. I mean, all of this when he was 10, alone. And so he excelled in most disciplines, including mathematics. He was a very gifted mathematician, but he wanted to study philosophy. And the way he tells it is because philosophy is the discipline that sort of allows you to never specialize, because anything can be the subject matter of philosophy, much to the despair of his maths teacher, because he was so good at maths. So then he rose through the ranks of French academia. He was at the very prestigious École Normale Supérieure, it's a bit of a strange institution. It's very French, where there's a very difficult competitive exam to enter. Once you're in, you're actually paid by the state, but then you have to work for the state afterwards, either as a teacher, professor, that kind of thing. So he did really well there, and then had various teaching jobs so he was trying to get back to Paris, because that's where a prestigious university career can happen. Yeah,
it sounds so much, as we're talking, very much like the life of a classical academic, where it's like, I just want to go back home and I just want to do what I want to do. It's like, and then he's able to finally get back to Paris. I want to ask you, about actually, his relationship. As we were saying earlier, he's a Jewish man. Does religion factor into his, intellectual evolution over time? Is he thinking about the world around us and philosophy in terms of, say, the spiritual or supernatural, or is this just kind of a thing that's kind of sitting on the outside of his life?
So it's interesting, because him being Jewish definitely impacts him in his life, obviously, because France, especially in the first half of the 20th century, is an extremely and second half of the 19th century, there's a lot of anti-Semitism going on there. And actually, Bergson kind of, I think, sort of downplayed, or at least he wasn't outspoken about some of the famous kind of controversy, miscarriage of justice that happened in France, called the Dreyfus Affair, where this Jewish officer, was unjustly accused of treason, and it was actually all fabricated. And for several decades, the whole country was torn between the pro-Dreyfus and the anti-Dreyfus. And the anti-Dreyfus people were extremely anti-Semitic. Bergson, it was impossible to not have an opinion about this, and yet Bergson said nothing, I think, to sort of preserve himself, because he was trying to be seen as a good French academic, and he didn't want to. But in terms of philosophy influencing his religion, influencing his philosophy, it's interesting because, as you've already mentioned, he was so focused on the science of his day for so long, and it's only kind of later in his career when he starts getting interested in questions of mysticism, and this is very late in his career, that he actually turns towards Catholicism, and he starts reading Christian mystics, and he's kind of tempted to actually convert to Catholicism, But by the time he's thinking about this, it's the 90s. And he does not want this to be seen as an act of sort of rejection of his Jewish heritage at a time when Hitler is getting into power. And so he doesn't ever officially convert. But I do believe he asked for there to be a priest on his deathbed. So it's fascinating really to see how much the history the context played into his relationship to religion as well.
Yeah, I found that this was really, you wrote about this idea of like towards the end of his days, and he's in ill health. He's obviously thinking about, the end, and says, he sees Catholicism as the logical conclusion, if I recall correctly, to Judaism, the logical next step to Judaism, but doesn't want to betray his own faith, betray his own people, as this world is plunging into anti-Semitism, and I appreciated that. I'm not a religious guy, but, like a lot of people, I grew up in a faith, and for myself in like a Southern Baptist kind of thing in a very rural area here in the States. And I don't practice that faith, but there's still this idea that you're tied to it in some form. And I guess maybe that was, I don't know, that was a way in which I really kind of found myself relating to his ties. And like one is like, no, this is kind of who I've always been, even though, maybe I'm kind of moving on elsewhere. I want to ask you about the Durée, because boy, did I ever get into this. As an environmental scholar, I very much started reading about the Longue Durée very, very quickly early on. And to see this idea, and I'm kind of, thinking, wait a second, maybe this is actually what's maybe the precursor to a lot of the work that I do as far as like as a scholar looking at very long periods of time, evolution, things like that, and so forth. And this seems to be the first thing that really kind of puts him on the map. Is that right? This idea of the Durée. Can we talk about what this is, what the Durée is, and why this matters, and where does this come from?
Sure. So it's a difficult thing to sum up. I'm going to do my best, and you can stop me if I go on for too long. You can just stop me. But it's the central idea of his philosophy, really. This idea of durée, rather than sort of mathematical time, rather than time as we normally conceive of it. And so the way he tells it, he came to this idea of durée when he realized that time as it is represented in the equations of mechanics. So this is in the late 19th century, in the 1880s. So the way that time is represented in the equations of mechanics contains no temporality. It's sort of temporality stopped in its tracks, frozen in a way that makes it easier to measure, easier to sort of manipulate as a scientist. And he's saying that's obviously quite useful, but it is not what time actually is, and it's not how our consciousness experiences time. There's a useful thought experiment he uses in his first book that was translated under the title Time and Free Will, where he imagines a magical entity that is able to accelerate time. So you imagine that the Earth spins on its axis every 12 hours. It takes 12 hours instead of 24 hours. Everything else accelerates proportionally. So there's this increase in tempo. He says to the equations of the astrophysicist, this would make no difference at all, because all the proportions in the equations would be preserved. And yet to the astrophysicist or to anyone experiencing this change, there would be a huge difference felt, sort of qualitative rather than quantitative difference felt. Sure. And that is precisely what has to be removed from the equations of the scientist, and even everyday language when we're talking about time. So far, I haven't told you what durée is. I've just told you sort of what it's not. But really what he's talking about is something that paradoxically kind of resists language. And that's often the kind of phrase that puts people off from philosophy completely when you start saying things like that. But I'll try and explain. There's a sense in which, not just in scientific equations, but also everyday language, it kind of tricks us into doing the similar thing where we're stopping our own internal experience. We're cutting it up into manageable portions. We're stopping our own experiences in their tracks to be able to talk about them. We'll say things like, I was hungry, but then I ate. We use these clear-cut before and after words. I used to be a child, but now I'm an adult, which sort of seems to presume that there's a clear point where you stop being a child and you become an adult. And what Bergson is saying is this is quite artificial. It's an artificial and spatialized way of thinking about time, which is actually something that's kind of a never ceasing flow with no before and after, or at least the not such clear cut. It's the past pushing into the present, pushing towards the future. There's no, you can't cut it up into these units that then are interchangeable. Please, again, stop me if I'm becoming too abstract or too.
Emily, this is a podcast about a philosopher. Abstract is our jam today.
Okay,
by all means, please.
And and again, he uses a lot of images because concepts are not going to do the job here. Since we're describing something that resists sort of conceptual language, he invites the readers, and I often think this probably comes from his father being a musician. He uses melody a lot to describe Duret. So if you think about a melody, there's one way of thinking about it where it's just a series of symbols on a page juxtaposed, and they're kind of interchangeable and you can move them around on the page. And it's useful for sort of recording and sharing music, but it has little to do with how that music will be experienced. When you're listening to a melody, you're not hearing a juxtaposition of notes, you're hearing notes melting into one another, and the melody itself kind of swelling, forming a kind of organic whole. And if a single note were to be displaced, that would change the entire melody. It wouldn't mean, that just one unit has been displaced. It would change the whole. So that's one way of thinking about Duret as it's experienced by consciousness. Pure succession rather than juxtaposed moments like we would see it represented on a line, a timeline, for instance. That's a very artificial and spatialized way of thinking about time. And actually, Bergson has this kind of beautiful way of thinking about time where it's a lot more like a snowball rolling down a hill, accumulating snow as it grows. So the idea would be time that passes isn't lost, but it's actually gained. It's sort of time for a consciousness. It's constantly adding. So that's the basic introduction, I think, to Duret.
What was the reception when he comes up with this idea of Duret? Because this is, I think, you talk about how he's pushing back against these ideas of time stopping, things like that, where you use that analogy of Achilles and the tortoise. So as you started to talk about this, I remembered many years ago hearing about this story in my own philosophy classes in college. What was the reception? Did this immediately catapult him into the stars, or what happened afterwards?
So this was the idea he presented first in his PhD dissertation, which then was his first book. And he kind of lodged it in between two of the main debates or big debates of the time. One had to do with sort of experimental psychology, and he was very critical of certain versions of quantification in experimental psychology. And then the other was a debate about free will. And so all of the examiners, when he did his Viva, PhD Viva, all they wanted to talk about were those two debates, and they sort of completely missed what he viewed as the most important thing, which was this idea of Duret. So he was very disappointed. So his first book, I think, was quite well received, and within sort of French academia, it was seen as a work of note, but it did not propel him to international fame. And then his second book, which had to do with memory, again, very well received, slightly wider reception, really consolidates him as an important figure within French academia. But it's only in a few decades later, because his first book was 1889, it's not until 1907 when he publishes Creative Evolution, where he's kind of expanded his view of Duret to not just individual consciousness, but actually to sort of the history of life as a whole. That's when he really blows up in terms of fame. And the book is translated into many languages. It's a very difficult book, but it was very widely read and bought, and it was a bestseller, a sort of metaphysical book, massive bestseller. I
have to imagine the whole time I'm reading your book, I'm wondering, and I don't think he would have done this, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm imagining Henri with a podcast, with his own social media platform. I get the sense he would have hated it based off what you're talking about, his relationships with cinema and things like that. But I couldn't help but think about the man with the platform of a century later and what he would have done with it. What about, Emily, what about laughter? This is another piece of his. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So this is the book between his big book on memory and between his big book on evolution. There's this much smaller book that comes out in 1900, which is actually a collection of 3 essays he writes on the theme of laughter, which was quite well received again at the time, I think, for a wider audience, and you can sort of see why, because it's not a theme that you see philosophers exploring that often. Actually,
I was intrigued.
It's deemed quite trivial, I would say, by a lot of philosophers, and has been throughout the history of philosophy. And interestingly, in secondhand bookshops in the English-speaking world, that's usually, if they have a Bergson book, that will be the one. Even though most Bergson scholars would not consider it to be important at all, or as important as his other works, which I don't know if I agree with, because it's quite remarkable. So he decides to write about laughter because he believes it's one of those rare and interesting phenomena where the biological and the cultural intersect.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously laughter is a product of our evolution, and at the same time it's eminently cultural, and it has to do with aesthetics. It has to do with that you can write treatises about, and Aristotle did, about comedy. And comedy, what's considered funny, sort of varies over time and through culture. And he wants to study laughter as a living thing, as a living phenomena. So he's not really going to come up with a strict definition, but he's going to almost be like a zoologist, looking at where we find laughter, under what circumstances laughter emerges. And so he has sort of 3 observations, which I think are quite cool, so the first observation is that what is comical, what makes us laugh, is always strictly human. Even if we're laughing at a dog, it's usually because we are anthropomorphizing it in some way. Even if we laugh at a hat on its own, it's because we're imagining either the person who made the hat or the head it would be sitting on. A second observation, which might be counterintuitive, is that laughter is sort of the antithesis to emotion. You can't be in a strong emotional state and laugh at the same time. You can sort of go from one to the other very quickly, but laughter requires a form of distance that emotion doesn't allow. And actually, the fact that we manage to laugh in times of hardship and that it's seen as so therapeutic is because probably it does help us take a step back from the awful thing we're going through, And then the final observation, which is very important, is the idea that laughter always is in need of an echo. It's an eminently social phenomenon. Even if you're laughing by yourself, there's always kind of an imagined audience. I just think those 3 observations are quite simple, but very profound. And it kind of shows how seriously he takes this quite seemingly trivial subject. And these 3 observations sort of lead him to this idea that laughter is a social phenomenon. It's no accident that it requires an echo. It's because it has a kind of evolutionary social purpose. And there's this idea that there are all sorts of ways in which evolution has adapted us to be adaptable, to be able to survive, to adapt to certain situations. And laughter is kind of one of those, but more in the social sense rather than in the strictly biological sense. It helps us be pliable and adaptable socially. If we didn't have laughter, then there might be behaviors that would be too rigid for our societies would collapse.
Yeah.
This idea that laughter kind of punishes attitudes that are slightly too rigid. And that doesn't mean that they're, morally bankrupt positions always. We laugh at Ned Flanders for being too, morally righteous.
Right.
Because he's too rigid in his sort of way of thinking. And that is actually not helpful to a society. A society requires of its members to have a kind of fluidity in terms of adaptability. And laughter is something that just comes and forces us to have that. And I find that really cool as an idea.
Yeah, I love the idea of laughter like this evolutionary mechanism that makes society happen, that makes it function, I want to ask you, though, we're talking about his relationships to intellectual thought, his relationships to his religion, his upbringing, and things like that. I want to ask you about his relationships to women.
Mm-hmm.
This is all over the book. First and foremost, I want to ask you about Louise, his wife. Mm-hmm. This man does not exist, and I don't think, based off of what I'm reading, that his career is capable without his partner, without his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about who Louise was and the role that she played maybe in his work, but also what their relationship is? They say married their entire lives. Who is this woman, and why is she important to our story here?
Yeah, so I struggled to find much about her, which was always very frustrating. And, in anything I'd read about him, she was always sort of barely mentioned, if ever mentioned. But as you say, she's so crucial to, as were most women, wives of great men in parentheses, in quotation marks.
We're laughing at the great men.
Yes.
Yes.
But so she was from a quite wealthy Jewish family, Parisian family. Her mother was actually the cousin of Proust's mother. So she was sort of second cousin to Proust. Mm-hmm. And so through marriage, Bergson was also related to Proust. And Proust was his best man at his wedding. That's just a little side note. But she was very young when they met and married. She was sort of barely older than some of his high school students. And he was sort of in his 30s, I think, at the time when they married. And essentially throughout, as far as I can tell, they had a very happy marriage and a very happy, well, happy, I don't know if it is the word, but as in they seem to have had a deep connection, and that kind of transpires through her own correspondence that I've been able to find. But she was, what we would call devoted. She was carrying out all the emotional, administrative, all the kinds of labor that need to happen for someone like him to then be able to do his lectures, his books, his writing. And they had a daughter together, and she also kind of never left the family home. She was born deaf, so that might have had something to do with it. But both women sort of carried him through what were very challenging times, I think, for him. As we sort of touched upon, he was one of the most famous people in the world, and he was someone who hated noise. So there's this, I think that there's one anecdote that really stood out to me as kind of epitomizing what Louise was doing for him, which is that when they had a telephone installed in their home, she made sure that no one had their number, that it would just be used to give out calls, because she knew that sort of the sound of a mechanical ringing device would, drive him insane. And it's just that all those things, just making it possible for him to have some quiet sometimes. And these forms of labor are always, often at least, sort of undervalued or unspoken. And so I really wanted to make sure that I made a point of underlining sort of the role that she played in all of this, in what, as far as I can tell, yes, appeared to be a very loving relationship and life together. And yet, I don't know if Bergson scholars give her due,
Well, that was the thing that I really appreciated in the book, because I think that you and I both, through our own studies as historians, are all too familiar with these stories, especially of the quote unquote great men of history, great men of whatever, right? Especially of academics. This seems to be a very prone thing, where you'll find that the great mind, the man, is doing all the quote unquote work. And then yet it's his wife, or perhaps the secretary or whatever, who is doing all the actual labor of making this work possible. And then she gets footnoted, if we're lucky, in history. And they're just reading through the book and seeing what I thought was the immense trust. And I think you're right. It's hard to get a sense, a different time, different era of romantic relationships. Was this a working relationship between the two of them? Because it feels like he had ties to other people, but at the same time, he entrusts her with this last thing where he's like, burn all of my stuff, do all, and she devoutly does, right? Going as far as like excluding parts of his will from the public view to protect his legacy.
Yeah.
There was clearly a deep connection there. And I don't get the sense that he functions without her.
No, absolutely. Especially when you read his correspondence, it's always him being like, I am so tired, I'm so tired, I'm so tired, I'm so tired. And I think he would clearly, because he was solicited from all areas, there was constant noise and invitations and things. So if you take away the practical and emotional labor that she was doing, then he would have just collapsed for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you about another woman, however, in his life, because she continues to come up. I know you don't know who I'm talking about. I want to talk about Marie Rafatovich. Am I pronouncing this correct?
Rafalovich, yes. It's a Russian name, so I don't speak Russian, so,
Me either. Let's talk about Marie, though, because it seems like he also has this very deep connection to her. She comes up in his correspondence as well. Who was this woman, and what was their relationship?
So she had come to Paris with her husband, I believe, to escape anti-Semitic laws as well. But I might be getting her mixed up with another Russian woman who. It's been a while since I've written the book now, but
Yes.
But she was a wealthy woman who became very important in French academic life circles. She used to go to the lectures of a physiologist called Claude Bernard, who was a very important French scientist, and kind of became his confidant. And she had she was able to forge these relationships and also become very influential in the French academic scene. And she was also a prolific writer. And, she was just this extremely impressive person who spoke many, many languages and who held salon type gatherings and that kind of thing. And it got to a point where she could kind of make or break academic careers, it seems like, or at least she was well connected enough to be able to have influence, really. And she and Henri, when he was at the beginning of his career and trying to rise in the ranks, started a friendship. He clearly was very good at what we call networking now, at sort of getting into the right circles and getting in with the right people. But their relationship was also very philosophical. She was the kind of person he would be much later, corresponding and having deep philosophical conversations with. But there were other actually. So there were women like her who did help him, I think, get his job at the Collège de France, which is where he lectured, because she was so well connected that, she would have been able to put in a good. Obviously, he was already sort of renowned and, his work was well respected. But, how academia is, it's not always down to being the best scholar. There's also a lot of politics going on. And so she clearly would have helped him campaign, for his job. But there were other women like her that sort of these highly educated, highly intelligent, wealthy women who were able to sort of spend their time thinking about philosophy. And a lot of them gravitated towards Bergson, various countesses but then also women. I mean, I don't know if you were going to get to that, but sort of also just his lectures were also attracted lots and lots and lots of women. And not all of them were rich women. A lot of them were, I think, women who would have liked to be able to study philosophy at the Sorbonne, but couldn't. And because the Collège de France the lectures there are public lectures, and they still are. This is an institution that's existed for centuries, where the idea is that there's no enrollment, there's no exams, it's just open lectures. And that became a feature, that became something the press picked up on, that his lectures, were almost 50% women, in the lecture theatre, and that was a cause of mockery. He was mocked for that, and the women themselves were mocked because it was said that they were clearly incapable of understanding the philosophy, so they were just going there because it was the fashionable thing to do. It was said of him that if so many women were interested in his philosophy, then it couldn't be very good philosophy. It was used against the women as a reason to not give them the vote in Parliament. I found this article that shows that one of the French elected officials, during a debate about whether to give women the vote, sort of was saying, well, it's all well and good to be reading about Bergsonian intuition and things like this, but these are not tools for rational thinking, and these are not tools for citizens to be making informed decisions. So it kind of was used against Bergson, against the women, in a circular movement. And it's all a really fascinating aspect of his fame. And I think, again, without these women, maybe he wasn't as famous as he was. He wouldn't have been.
No, Emily. And all I can think is that now I know that the United States and France share a history of fearing educated women. So, so there's that. Actually, there were other critiques of his work. And let's talk a little bit about Bertrand Russell. Because it doesn't really seem like that was a very, very good relationship between the two of them. As Henri is skyrocketing to fame. You get famous, you start to do great work. Inevitably, it feels like there's always someone who wants to bring you down. Can we talk a little bit about the critiques that he had, that Bergson had as he shot to fame, and maybe some of these people that he kind of quarreled with throughout his career?
Yeah, sure. So I'll get to Bertrand Russell in a second,
sure.
But since I was talking about the women, one terrifying but interesting aspect of the misogyny that these women faced, and the sort of the misogynistic attacks that were also sort of that he received, it was often correlated, or it often came with anti-Semitism as well. So there were on the French far right, there were these thinkers who associated femininity with sort of a lack of rationality. And so therefore, and also this idea that France, as the country of Descartes, of rationality, Cartesian rationality, a quality that, a thought that is associated with masculine values or whatever, something like that. Then Bergson, as this Jewish, in their eyes, anti-rationalist thinker, which he wasn't, but that's how they qualified him. And who was so promoting a feminized vision of philosophy. And also he wasn't French because Jewish. That's, what they said. They called him a barbarian. So those were some of the attacks, vicious attacks that he would receive between sort of 1910 and 1914. Constantly in the press, in their own sort of outlets, they had far right journals and newspapers that they would write horrible things about him. So there's that, which was obviously terrible. So you brought up Bertrand Russell, which is Russell is one of the reasons I firmly believe that Bergson was sort of wiped away from the history of Western philosophy in the Anglophone world, because Russell, is literally the author of a history of Western philosophy that became a bestseller that still is, well regarded. We were talking about sorry, I'm going on a million tangents, but we were talking about the invisible labor of women. It was one of Russell's wives that did a lot of the research for that book, and she's not really mentioned. Anyway. But so what happened was, Russell, for those who don't know, Bertrand Russell he's considered kind of one of the founders or one of the leading figures of what is called analytic philosophy. And it's very difficult to summarize in a few sentences what analytic philosophy is. But I guess he was very interested in logic and the ways in which language could be made less ambiguous using logic. And he was, in that regard, very different from Bergson. So two very different styles of doing philosophy. Because I've already mentioned Bergson actually used a lot of metaphorical language and believed that sort of the concepts that we use in logic and in science somehow sort of remove us from reality in a certain regard. So it's completely different. Right, so they were never going to get along. But what happened was Bergson was invited to the UK, and at this point he was really famous, around 1911, 1912. And Russell was meant to be giving the presidential address for the Aristotelian Society, and Bergson's visit moved that talk. So that was the first strike against Bergson. Russell was extremely annoyed. And also at this point, Russell did go on to become quite famous, but he wasn't quite there yet at this point. So Bergson was the big famous figure coming. Then the presidential address itself happened, and apparently, we don't know exactly what went down, but Bergson was quite critical of Russell in the sort of question portion, and Russell was humiliated and very annoyed again. And so then he made it his personal mission to take Bergson down, and he wrote this very angry sort of paper that then he published, I think in 1912, called The Philosophy of Bergson, where he really caricatures Bergson a lot, and he kind of paints him as this anti-rationalist, anti-science, anti-mathematics figure who doesn't understand science, doesn't understand mathematics, which is all demonstrably false. So Bergson is critical of what he views as the limitations of some of the methods of science, without at any point saying that scientists shouldn't be doing their stuff. He's just saying philosophy, there's room for philosophy to do its own thing and kind of complement what the scientists are doing. So that's very different than being anti-science in the way that Russell was suggesting. And he also kind of suggested that Bergson was mathematically illiterate, which again, demonstrably false. He was actually a bit of a maths genius.
Quite great at math.
Yeah. So and there's kind of a pattern of Russell doing this with other thinkers. He did it with William James as well, sort of caricaturing to take down. But unfortunately, sort of that vision, because Russell rose to such prominence in the English-speaking world, and for good reason, because, he produced incredible work in analytic philosophy, that caricature kind of stuck. And it was then reproduced sort of word for word 30 years later in his History of Western Philosophy, which was published after Bergson died. So that kind of cemented the fate of Bergson seen as this historical curiosity, interesting, but not, not necessarily valid in terms of philosophy, when actually, it's obviously a lot more complicated than that, and a lot more interesting than that. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, was to kind of correct that, and undo some of these misconceptions for an Anglophone audience who So either they'd never heard of Bergson, which, is a lot of people, or they'd heard of him in a Monty Python sketch. There's one Monty Python sketch that sort of references him, and the joke being that he's so obscure, that's kind of the butt of the joke, or who have heard of him through Russell. So I kind of wanted to tell his story and also kind of rectify some of those misconceptions, which I've always found frustrating. So sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, not at all.
I get very animated.
I found this rivalry fascinating. I was shaking my fist at Russell the whole time I'm reading, and I loved the Monty Python reference at the end of the book. I was thinking about this as you were telling the story. I was like, I wonder if she's going to tell me about the Monty Python thing, because it's brilliant, and it's like when we put this out on Instagram or on Blue Sky, we'll have to find the clip.
Yeah.
Attach it to this. There's another big thing before we start talking about the wrap towards the end of his life that we should probably talk about. World War I. This man does not live the life of what I thought a philosopher would live. I felt almost, Emily, in some ways, and this is a bit of a stretch, I know, but like watching the latter Indiana Jones films, when you find out he goes off and does all this stuff during World War II, you're like, wait, he did all these other what? I felt a bit like this with Bergson, where he's got this different life. His life takes on this completely different role in World War I. Can we talk a little bit about Bergson in the war? Yeah,
so not only when the war breaks out in 1914, he comes out as, so he's this person who's never talked about politics publicly, never sort of talked about anything other than philosophy, and he suddenly comes out as this quite patriotic. He gives these speeches, very almost veering on the nationalistic side, almost, but very emotional speeches. So that's the first aspect of the war. But I think what you're getting at is what happens slightly later in the war, where he is sort of formally invited by the French government to take part in a mission that they've concocted for him, where they want to convince, US President Woodrow Wilson that the US should join the war on their side. He had obviously campaigned he'd just been re-elected, had campaigned on he kept us out of the war. That was kind of his running platform.
Right.
So they were trying to figure out how to convince him. And they thought, if we send a diplomat, if we send officials, it's going to be seen as too aggressive. It's not going to be well received at all. Why not send world-famous philosopher Henri Bergson to go and chat to Wilson, knowing that, Wilson, I think, was president of Yale before?
Princeton, I think.
Princeton, sorry, yeah, I knew I was going to get that wrong. So he was a philosophy enjoyer. He was, someone who they knew would probably be interested in what someone like Bergson would have to say. And so Bergson crosses the Atlantic at a time when submarine warfare is going on. So it's a very dangerous thing to do. And he manages so he spends quite a long time. So this is in 1917. He spends quite a long time there, and he manages to form friendships with all of Wilson's advisors, to have these really intimate conversations with all of them, to get intel on what the president is thinking, that he relays back to the French government. It's a very strategic thing that he's doing. And he later wrote about it, saying, I didn't want to ever tell the story of this because I didn't want the people I became friends with over there to feel betrayed, to feel used, because essentially that was what he was doing, even though I think in the process he did become friends with these people. And so eventually he manages to get in the room with Wilson. And so we have his notes. We have his notes, sort of preparatory notes. We don't know what actually was said, but we know that he would have been sort of using this kind of platform of, if the US want to have a say in what would become the League of Nations, they would have to be part of the war to have a seat at that table. Things like that he knew from his own intel and from that would potentially sway Wilson. And we all know what happened next. Wilson, the US did eventually join. Whether Bergson had an impact, or whether the impact was real or not, I mean, I like to think that it certainly played a small part, because the reasons that Bergson was putting forth are some of the reasons that Wilson eventually adopted to justify. And so I think that in itself, that's the thing that blows people's minds about the book. In the middle of this biography of a philosopher, there's this really interesting World War I history.
There's it's almost like a spy novel at some point in time. I mean, he becomes like this diplomat, and I think it's a brilliant move actually on the part of the French to reason with Wilson on a very cerebral scale. Right, this is a guy, and Wilson himself was, very, I think, really thought of himself in that manner. So why not send a guy who can, frankly, speak his language?
Yeah, that seems to have been the reasoning. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk about after the war. Into the 90s, his health declines. What? And this is really when he begins to fade into obscurity. Can we talk about his closing years? What happens to this man? Because he goes from being the world's most famous man. He's more famous than Darwin. He's more famous than anybody. He's this guy. He's all over the world. And then, he ends up living in what you say is like a poorly heated place there in Paris in his final days. What happens to this man? Because it's so sad.
And it's such a sharp decline kind of from the sort of meteoric rise to fame where people are queuing in front of his lecture theatre.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that happens is that he stops lecturing. So he sort of stopped lecturing in 1914, probably thinking he would go back, and then never went back. And I think of why a lot of his appeal was apparently his lectures were incredible. So a lot of his fame came from that. But then obviously what also has happened in between is World War One. And so a lot of the reasons that, the hopes and ideals and ideologies that had drawn people to Bergson before the war had dramatically shifted. In a very quick a period of time, people's whole outlook had just changed because of the cataclysm that had just occurred. There's also the fact that, as I mentioned briefly, the nationalistic tone of some of the speeches Bergson delivers at the beginning of the war, some of his more left-leaning fans were quite disappointed by that. And I think it was taken, what I think were sort of these kind of emotional, we're talking first few days of the war, heated kind of, reactions, stuck and painted this image of someone, who was a bit radical, I guess, and when actually I think he was very middle of the road kind of guy. There's also the fact that, as you mentioned, he was quite ill from around the mid-20s. He had sort of horrendous rheumatoid arthritis that kind of paralyzed him a bit, or he had just had horrible joint swelling and fevers and undergoing all sorts of treatments. And I kind of interpret that as his body kind of just collapsing from 25 years of burnout, of, never taking a second to stop and going all over the world and doing all sorts of things and working all the time and the constant noise. So it's kind of just his body just collapsing. Very briefly as well, in 1922, he's sort of drawn into this public debate with Einstein, where he is so almost against his will, kind of drawn into this public debate. Both of them kind of missing each other. Bergson trying to explain to Einstein that something that he'd been trying to explain his whole life, really, that he believes that once the physicist is done speaking, the philosopher still has a lot to say. And Einstein having this sort of really dry one-line response where he says the time of the philosopher does not exist. And that kind of cemented him as the winner of the debate at a time when Bergson wasn't able really physically to defend himself.
Yeah.
So all of these things combined meant that by the 1930s, when he publishes his final book, some people were surprised to find out that he was actually still alive in 1932.
Amazing.
So he was very old by then. Well, he would have been in his 70s by the time he published his final book, and he was in his 80s when he died. And yeah, it's a quite sad end of life, because, as you said, it's kind of, he dies in Nazi-occupied Paris, and that hence the lack of coal to heat the apartment, because there was just, everything was rationed. But I find it very inspiring at the same time, because so despite the illness, despite everything, he was still able at the end of his life to have these kind of deep, meaningful conversations with people, and to lead the life that he kind of always wanted to lead, where he was just doing philosophy in peace, in peace and quiet. And then there's also the fact that, and this ties back to stuff we were saying at the beginning about his relationship to anti-Semitism and to being Jewish, and the way he didn't want to kind of be perceived as rejecting his Jewish heritage. At the very end of his life, when Nazis were occupying Paris, he was offered exemption by the collaborationist French government from all the anti-Semitic measures because he was a Nobel Prize winner, one of France's great men. And he refused this exemption. And so he actually contracted pneumonia from waiting in line to register as a Jew, as all Jewish people were forced to do. But so one of his final acts was kind of an act of defiance and of moral, something highly moral, I think, that he did. And so he died, he didn't live to see the end of the war, sadly. But it's said, and I kind of want to believe this because it's said by various reliable sources, that in his final hour, he just launched into a lecture. He was sort of comatose and then suddenly launches into a philosophy lecture, ends with, "Gentlemen, it is 5:00, class is over," and then died, which is, it doesn't get much cooler than that in terms of philosopher deaths, apart from maybe Socrates,
Well, yeah, Socrates wins, but this was a good way to go out. I have to ask you, Emily. You may know I've been running historians of movies now for like 6 years. I do this other thing with films and things like that, and I kept thinking in terms of your book as a movie. So I guess maybe the last thing I want to ask you, as we kind of come to a close here, is this: you reflect on this amazing man and this life and times in which he lived, of all of these things going around him. You're making a movie about Henri. Who do you cast who do you?
Well, I've actually been thinking about this because I think it would make such a great film.
Mm-hmm.
Simply because of all the, as you said, it ties in so many aspects of early 20th century culture, and there's World War I, World War II, all of this. So I was thinking, and this might be, people might not be too happy with this, but I'm thinking Timothée Chalamet, he's got this, I'm thinking more in terms of physical attributes. He's got the slim face, quite a big forehead, which is essential for Bergson. I recently saw a picture of him. I don't know if he's in a period piece at the moment, but where he's got a little mustache, very sort of early 20th century mustache. And I thought he would be perfect, especially since he speaks French, so he'd be able to pronounce all the names. I don't know if he's not necessarily my favorite. I mean, I have nothing against Timothée, and he's a fine actor. He's not necessarily my favorite, but just the physicality of it, I just do see him there. They'd have to age him a bit, because the height of Bergson's fame, he was already in his views. But yeah, you'd have to find someone who's got this, slightly odd-looking person. Sorry, Timothée.
No. Like, listen, Timothée Chalamet is making enough movies and enough money. He'll be okay with our thoughts on him. You know who I got to thinking about was Edward Norton.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think of that.
Kind of a slight frame.
I'm going to Google his...
but he's got the face.
I'm going to Google him now just so I can look what he looks like now.
I was thinking someone in his mid-50s?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
I mean, I don't, I'm sure there are many French actors that would probably fit the bill, but we're probably not as familiar with them here stateside. But
no, I can see it. Yeah.
I want a Netflix series on this man. That's what I actually want, because all of these different aspects give me like a 4 or 6-part series on this man's life
and there's
the
lots
world
of
around him.
Yeah, I was just going to say, there's so much stuff we didn't have time to touch upon. There's all the stuff about the spiritualist side of things with the occultists and, the Einstein debate and all these things. I agree would make a great series. So if anyone knows anyone at Netflix who we could pitch this to, that would be amazing.
Yeah, in fact, so for people who've been listening, I have purposely been dancing around because I do not want to give away the entirety of this book because it's amazing. And we have this amazing discussion, you and I, for the last hour or so, but there's so much more in this book about this man, the world around him, these intellectual conversations he's having. Emily, this has been so much fun to sit down and read this book and spend the time reading from you and then sitting and talking to you about this man and everything else. This has been amazing. Thank you so much
for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
This has been delightful. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much to our amazing guest, Dr. Emily Herring. We're going to say bonsoir to you tonight. That is the completion of all of my French. But guys, thank you so much for being here, for listening to Reckoning with Jason and Emily tonight. And we'll catch you later.